This is the 401k Fridays podcast, and I'm your host, Rick Unser. If you're a retirement plan fiduciary or administer your company's retirement plan, you've come to the right spot. Our format is pretty simple. In each episode, we select a timely and informative workplace retirement plan topic, we pick the brain of an expert guest, and provide you the hard-to-find perspective you need to make informed decisions that benefit your plan, your employees, and company. Now here we go with this week's episode. This episode was a real treat for me, and hopefully it will be for you as well. I'm excited to share my conversation with the Honorable Phyllis Borzi, the former Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Employee Benefits Security Administration under President Obama. We covered a range of topics that, regardless of your involvement with workplace retirement plans, should keep your interest. I'm also proud that while we talked about her time at the DOL, the majority of our focus was looking forward and exploring how her experience can help employers today and those who want to shape the future of our workplace retirement system. We hit on two pieces of unfinished business Phyllis wished she had more time to work on while she was at the DOL, what the Perez Principle is, and whether employers also suffer from choice overload in retirement plans. Phyllis also touched on a few topics that were near and dear to her heart and shared what she thinks of some of the current retirement proposals in front of Congress today to reform the retirement system. Be prepared for some candid insight and some very different perspective than, frankly, what I was expecting going into the conversation. Oh, and don't miss our call to action at the end. Before we get started, if you have an idea for a topic or future guest on the podcast, we'd love to hear about it. Shoot me an email to feedback@401kfridays.com, and we'll take it from there. And now, I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, Phyllis, thanks for joining me. I'm excited to have you, and I am really looking forward to our conversation today on the podcast about all sorts of fun things about your background experience and maybe some ideas and advice for people going forward.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it as well. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for being here. Why don't we just start with, from what I understand of your background, you were an academic and then eventually became a political appointee who wound up being the longest serving Assistant Secretary of Labor in history. So how did all that come about?
Well, I have had a pretty varied career, I might say checkered career. I was an academic. I was a research professor in the School of Public Health at George Washington University for a little over 16 years. But I actually have spent, of my 40 plus years in the benefits community, about half of it really has been in public service. I worked on Capitol Hill for 16, 17 years. I practiced law while I was at GW. And I've really worked in every sector of the economy, worked at a big law firm, worked at a small law firm. I come from a family of small businesses. So I never actually considered myself a true academic in the sense that that was the only niche I fulfilled. As a research professor, I did teach, and I was engaged in a lot of academic activities. But at the same time, I was practicing law and representing plan sponsors, mostly multi-employer plans, but plans and plan sponsors. And I think that's really, really important that I think it's important that people who work in government and who work on public policy issues also have a firm grounding in the operational side of it. People used to tease me when I worked on Capitol Hill that it was about time that I left the Hill and went to figure out how to comply with those awful laws that I helped write. And I think there's some merit to that. And it actually made me a better person to focus on public policy. Not so much because, although it certainly was true that I had a lot of experience and I understood how plans worked and what plan advisors did and the difficulties that plan sponsors have selecting their plan advisors and figuring out how best to comply with with the laws and the regulations. So it did help me in that respect. But most importantly, it gave me a network of people in the private sector, both in the plan sponsor community and the advisor community, the legal community, the actuarial community, et cetera, investment folks, that I could reach out to ask questions of when I needed information. And it was, I thought it was a very important part. And as to how I wound up being the longest serving assistant secretary, I guess it was just, there was lots to do. It took us much longer to do anything that we tried to do. And there was no, and I worked with absolutely phenomenal people. So it was a pleasure to go to work every day. The work was fun. The work was interesting. The people I worked with were terrific. And I guess I just was a slow learner. It took me a long time to get through things and to get things done. And when I left, there were still things that would have been on my wish list to do. And I guess we're going to maybe talk about some of that stuff. But I'm very grateful that I had all the different types of experience I had, because it gave me a greater appreciation of how complex and difficult every single issue is. I used to say all the time to my friends and my staff and to the people who would come and see me, if solving this problem, whatever the problem was that easy, somebody else would have figured it out long ago.
And one thing I'd love to get your input on is, I think whether it's within the industry or the plan sponsor community or just broad perceptions, I think a lot of people, when they think about the Department of Labor and when they think about their role or what they're doing to oversee or supervise, I'm not sure exactly what the right word is here, retirement plans, I think a lot of people have this perception that it's, we don't want to have the DOL involved in our life, or what can we do to stay off their radar screen, etc. And I don't know. I mean, obviously you spent 8 years there. Is that a good thing? Is that the perception that you want to have out in the community, or is maybe there a different way that the industry and employers should be looking at the Department of Labor and the role they play in workplace retirement plans?
Well, I certainly appreciate and understand people's view of that, because even though I had a lot of interaction with the Department of Labor career staff and the politicals for that matter over my whole career, when I was on the Hill, when I was in the private sector, when I was in academic life, I had a lot of actual interaction with folks there. And I always was impressed by their knowledge, by their willingness to talk. And so I came to my job with this sort of residual feeling of goodwill towards the people that worked at the Department of Labor. But I surely dealt with a lot of plan sponsors and many legal colleagues and many other lawyers, because I was very active in the American Bar Association and the local bar association, the DC Bar, and I did a lot of continuing legal education programs. I understand the reluctance people have to deal with the government, particularly in our context with the Department of Labor. But what I found is that the people at the department, that there was sort of this view of the big government. No, we don't want to get involved with them. But whenever I had to reach out to them, either because I had a question or a problem that I needed help with, or I wanted to just get on there were sometimes, actually, I know this is remarkable, there were sometimes that clients wanted to get on their radar screen, because what the clients always wanted, and it's understandable, is certainty. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to embark on this multi-million-dollar set of transactions if the Department of Labor was going to shut them down at the end of the process. So I did have clients when I was in private practice who wanted to reach out to the Department of Labor and work with them. And, honestly, both when I was in the private sector and when I was in the department, I found a willingness to work. Now, of course, if you came in and you said things like, I can remember vividly one group that came in and they had a great idea to deal with lifetime income, which is, of course, one of the things that I care about a lot. But their proposal involved it was a financial institution, and their proposal involved having nobody take fiduciary responsibility, and yet potentially millions of dollars slogging around through this system they were going to build. Well, obviously that's a non-starter. You can't have all these plan assets sitting out there and no one accepting fiduciary responsibility for it. So yes, I can understand you're not wanting to be involved, but honestly, the best advice I could give to people, both for my private sector work and for my government work, as to how to stay under the radar screen of the Department of Labor, is it really depends on who you select as your advisors. If you select advisors who are committed to compliance and want to work with you to figure out the best way in all good faith to comply with whatever the rules are, then you're going to be okay. But if you select people who want to help you figure out how to avoid complying with the rules, then by and large, you're putting yourself at risk. The Department of Labor, the 8 years that I was there, and I think it's certainly true, I can't speak for the current administration, but it certainly was true historically. What the career people at the department in the enforcement area want is they want compliance with the law. They're not there to play gotcha tricks. Their job isn't, they don't see their job as to, trick you into non-compliance so that they can impose penalties. Maybe if they got the money that they could impose, that, if a tax was due or whatever, they might have a different view, but really all they want is to make sure people get their benefits. And so compliance is job one for the people over there, whether they're the benefit advisors who help individuals and plan sponsors, particularly small plan sponsors. You can call in, you can get help from the benefit advisors, whether it's the people in our interpretation and regulation office who are very interested in helping clarify what the rules actually mean and how you can comply, or whether it's people in the enforcement office. What they want is for you to come into compliance. And so if you hire people who also have that, then your interests are aligned and you're not going to get into big trouble with the Department of Labor, assuming, of course, that the people you hire are reputable people. Because we often found, I shouldn't say often, we found sometimes that the plan advisors would be giving the plan sponsors, particularly the smaller plan sponsors, not very good advice, and they would get in trouble. That was actually one of the things that motivated us to look at changes in the conflicts of interest fiduciary rule, because we found many small employers, when we ultimately wound up having to investigate because a participant would report losses or malfeasance or whatever, and our investigators went in to investigate, what they found is that the small employer, the plan sponsor, had actually hired a service provider and was following the advice of the service provider, and it turned out that the service provider was either not competent, wrong, or, I hate to say it, a crook.
Yeah.
And so, we tried to be helpful to the plan sponsor. And so I think the hiring, I guess this is sort of a long way of saying that I think it's really important who you hire as your service providers, and people who have a reputation for being able to figure out the loopholes. If I were a plan sponsor, those wouldn't be the people that I would want to hire, because that just raises your risk profile.
Yeah, no, good point. And let me come back to something you said a minute ago, because I think just from a perception standpoint, this is important. And if I misheard you, please correct me. But I think, as you mentioned a second ago, the Department of Labor's goal in enforcement or in working with plans is to bring them into compliance, restore benefits, etc. Um, I think for some people, when they think about the Department of Labor, instantly they're thinking about, oh my gosh, fines or penalties, or what is this going to mean to us, and what can they do? What are the what does this mean if we're under an audit? Are we going to be is the company in jeopardy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's an interesting thing about the DOL is that even though you guys, from a financial standpoint, I think recover hundreds of millions of dollars in a given year, I think that's kind of different in the way that you go about it versus, well, we're just here to assess fines and penalties and move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a balancing act. It's definitely a balancing act, Rick, because you can't just focus on, if you're a regulatory agency like EBSA is, you can't just focus on compliance assistance, because you are going to find there that while the overwhelming number of people that wind up being investigated by the Department of Labor, they just are uninformed or whatever, and you can work with them to bring them into compliance. There are some people who they just don't care. Yeah. And so you have to balance compliance assistance with deterrence. So you have to have the ability to assess penalties and come down hard on people that aren't acting in good faith, while at the same time being able to have the discretion to let people move forward, even if they may have violated the law, to correct their violations and make people whole again. I mean, I can give you sort of an example, a hypothetical, but it's based on a true case. When the Affordable Care Act, generally what the department's position, I think this is true in other agencies besides EBSA, but it certainly was true with EBSA for many, many years, well before the Obama administration. Whenever a new law is passed, for a period of time, a few years after it's passed, the goal of the agency is to get out guidance and to try to help people understand what they have to do to comply. And enforcement takes on a different cast. It takes on the view of helping people to understand what the law is and to get into compliance. So it's not so much gotcha, let's impose these penalties that we have the authorization to impose. It's, sort of let's have a transition period where people can try to get up to speed and get in compliance. And then at a point, you have to say, okay, now if, you can't go on forever pleading ignorance of the law. And so I would use the ACA as the example. We've, most of the rules, in addition to the pension side, I had under my jurisdiction as Assistant Secretary of EBSA, I had implementation of the Affordable Care Act, and most of those rules were tri-agency rules: HHS, Labor, Treasury, and of course the service. Some said, we always called them tri-agency. I guess technically there was a fourth agency because of the service. But we all worked together. But really the Department of Labor was responsible for enforcing most of the market reforms. Obviously, Treasury, the service enforced all the tax penalties, and HHS had some things. But in the employer world, we had at the Department of Labor, we had the primary enforcement authority. And there was a major company, a household name company, which I'm not going to identify, but it was shocking to me that a company this large, about 4 years after the effective date of the ACA, we were getting lots of complaints. It was a nationwide company from people who weren't getting benefits, who weren't getting the benefit change. They were still having problems with pre-existing conditions. They weren't getting essential benefits. There were some very important market reform, insurance reform features of the ACA that they were not seeing implemented in their benefit plans and their health benefit plans. And so we started getting a lot of complaints across the country. So we looked into it. Obviously, it's more serious when you have what appears to be a pattern or practice than an individual thing. And what our investigators discovered is this company was acting like the ACA just didn't exist. I mean, and they had high-priced law firms. I mean, it wasn't like they were some mom and pop dry cleaner organization, with two people and they had their accountant. I mean, this was a company that with a fairly sophisticated compliance practice, but they had made a decision to ignore the ACA. And when we called them on it and tried to get them into compliance, they tried to argue that they were a grandfathered plan. And they tried to argue that because they were grandfathered, they could do whatever they wanted to do. Well, none of that was true. So that was a case in which compliance assistance was not going to be an effective tool because they had made a business decision that they could just blow off the ACA. So there, it was important to marry, if you will, compliance assistance with penalties. And we did impose penalties. And I honestly don't remember if we wound up suing them or not. But it was clearly a case in which they had made a business decision that it would be cheaper for them as a cost of doing business to deal with whatever, if they got caught, whatever they had to pay, than actually complying. So you do see some of that. So you do have to balance compliance assistance with having sufficiently strong enough penalties and the willingness to impose it when you have bad faith. And that's how I would characterize that. But that certainly was the outlier rather than the rule, the exception rather than the rule. Most of the people, when we got complaints from participants, people who looked at their 401k statement and the money had been withheld from their checks through payroll deduction, but it never got into their 401k account. When we tried to help people on that, oftentimes we spent a fair amount of our resources trying to chase that money. And there we had a combination of, one could say generously, maybe not quite fully understanding of the law, but also with a deliberate desire to use the money for other corporate purposes. And as I said, I come from a family of small businesses, so I understand that you're always going to put the money back. But this month you need that money that you've withheld from people's checks to go into their 401k to meet this other bill. And you just get farther and farther behind. So there's a combination of things. But I don't think it pains me to think that there are a lot of people out there that when they get into this kind of trouble would feel like they had to just ignore the Department of Labor. Because in my experience, both in the private sector and at the Department of Labor, I always had better luck when I discovered a problem to come and deal with the people at the department because they were very much in the problem. It was the difference between people who want to get to yes and people who want to get to no. And I think all of us in our work, in our lives, know the difference between people who want to get to yes and people who want to get to no. I would say my experience with the overwhelming number of people at the Department of Labor. I won't say everybody because there are always outliers. But if people came to us with problems, the desire was, it was always the presumption that we would try to get to yes to help them figure out how to solve the problem. Sometimes you couldn't get there, but that would be the attitude. So it makes me sad to think that there may be people out there that would sooner just bury their heads in the sand rather than try to reach out to the department. That's a long-winded answer, but
no, I appreciate the input, and I think that's good, good color and background. One of the things you mentioned a minute ago was some wish list items, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we look at the world of workplace retirement plans, 401k, 403b, 457, whatever it is, and I think that it would be hard to argue that the system is not working to some degree, meaning that there seems to be more money going into the plans every year, assets are
Mm-hmm.
growing,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But it's an imperfect system. There's certainly opportunities for improvement. There's opportunities to advance the benefits and the way that workplace retirement plans kind of factor into the role that they'll play in someone's retirement. So sorry for my long-winded question, but what are some of the things that, as you look out and as you had your experience at the Department of Labor or just over your career, what are a few of those things that are on your wish list that you're like, wow, this is great, but if we could do these couple things, it would be even better?
That's a terrific question. And it's one that I've now had because I'm retired from the Department of Labor and federal service. And I'm now living a life in which I can do what I want to do when I want to do it. And if I don't want to do it, if somebody calls me and asks me to do a project and I don't want to do it, I say no. So I've been doing a lot of more serious thinking about some of these things. If I were to go back to, if I could find the piece of paper that I'm a big list maker. So if I could go back and look at and find the list I probably made after as I was getting ready to be confirmed by the Senate for my job, I will say it was a relatively short list of things I knew to be problems and I wanted to work on. And there are at least two things, probably more as I talk, that I consider to be unfinished business. The top of the list is this set of lifetime income issues.
And to frame that, so if someone's never heard of lifetime income,
sure,
what does that mean?
So to me, what it means is, I don't want to use the phrase good old days, because in a voluntary system, you never really have good old days. Nothing is as good as you think it is, because in a system of carrots and sticks, you have to keep plumping up the carrot and sharpening the stick, and you never can get to universality in a voluntary system. And I think we just accept that because that's the system we have. But, if you look at where we were in 1974 when Congress passed ERISA, we had about half of the full-time non-manufacturing or manufacturing workers, employees in America had access to or were offered a pension savings arrangement at work. And then you fast forward to like 2016, certainly, I don't know the current numbers, but certainly 2016. Basically, that number hasn't changed. About half of the full-time non-agricultural workers in the United States, employees in the United States, are offered an opportunity to have a pension or a savings arrangement at the workplace. And that's despite the fact that there's been this incredible proliferation of retirement savings opportunities, retirement vehicles, and Congress is busy trying to churn out some more. In fact, that's one of the problems, that there's too many choices for employers, for potential plan sponsors, but that's it. I'll get to that in a minute. So the question of coverage is a big question. How are we going to get more people, more plan sponsors, more employers to want to be plan sponsors, to offer savings opportunities to their employees? And how do we get employees who are offered those savings opportunities to take advantage of it? Now, this latter part of the problem, getting employees who are offered the opportunity to save at the workplace, to take advantage of it, we've made terrific progress using the behavioral economic principles, the auto principles,
Yep.
auto enrollment, auto escalation. We've made great strides on that side, but we haven't moved the needle a bit. The threshold question about how can we get more plans, more employers into the plan sponsor mode. But one thing we have just seen is a tremendous shift from what people are offered, that 50% of people that are offered an opportunity to save at the workplace, traditional defined benefit. I'm not saying anything that your podcast listeners don't know. The kinds of arrangements that they had in those days, in the 74 days, were primarily defined benefit plans. Now what we have is primarily defined contribution plans. And that shift in responsibility from the employer to the individual, the shift of risks, investment risk is obviously the most important one, but longevity risk and some of these other types of risks, that has made a profound difference. And I'm getting to answer your question about what people who aren't pension gurus might understand as lifetime income. So the point is that in the 74-ish, in the DB era, what people got at the end of the road when they retired was a monthly check, income for life. They didn't have to worry about outliving their income because my parents, my dad worked when he came back from World War II, he worked for the same company for, 40 some odd years. He had a terrific defined benefit plan. And so he and my mom never had to worry after he retired. Every month they'd get a check. And when he passed away, my mother unfortunately didn't live too many years after he did, but she got a check. So they never had to worry about outliving their money. Today, when I retired, my primary retirement vehicle was my federal thrift savings plan,
Yep.
my 403B annuity from my teaching days, my 401k from my law firm days. And the benefit that I get from all of them is a pile of cash. I do have to worry about outliving my money. I do have to figure out how to make that money last. So the concern that I had and what I would have liked to have spent more time on and perhaps been able to develop some consensus around is how to convert, and I'm using that in the plain English
Sure.
meaning, not the legal meaning, how to translate, maybe that's a better word, how to translate that pile of money into a stream of monthly income so that every month I don't have to worry about my having to do the math to figure out how much I have to draw down to be able to pay my bills and still get along. There are lots of different ways you can do this, and it really does depend on the kind of product that you want to invest in. And in the lifetime income debate, if you will, the big fight has always been between the insurance companies and the mutual fund companies. The insurance companies believe that, and I don't want to sound skeptical on either side because I'm not really taking a side since I have both mutual funds and annuities in my own portfolio. The annuities provide sort of the closest approximation, or they could, a plain vanilla annuity provides the closest approximation to a monthly check for your life that you can't outgrow. I'm being very generic here because not all of these products have those same features, but this lifetime income guarantee is a very important part of the annuity marketplace and their sales pitch. And then you got the mutual funds, and the mutual funds will argue that they can pretty much replicate this lifetime income stream because we can give you a monthly check of income. However, there's always that possibility, however slight or large, depending on your health and other factors, that you might outlive your money. So a couple of options for people to have so that when they get to that point where they can get their pile of money, they have a reasonable choice. Some people, and I'm not saying that everybody has to take an annuity or everybody has to take lifetime income, because for some people, based on their financial status and their other sources of income, a lump sum might be fine. But so that's what I wish I had had more time in the 8 years I was at the department to devote to that issue, because I think it's one of the critically important issues for people. I divide the world into people who are in the system and people who are out of the system. So for people in the retirement system, that's probably their number one issue: how to make sure they don't outlive their money and how to translate their pile of money into a lifetime income stream. People on the other side of the equation, in terms of people who don't have access at their workplace to some sort of a retirement pension or retirement savings vehicle, that's in some respects a much harder problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's harder because absent requiring workplace savings arrangements, it's tricky to figure out the right combination of incentives to get more interest among the employer community. And there it's also complicated because the employee is, as you know, from workplace issues, employees are dinosaurs. There are so many other types of workplace arrangements that don't fall into the traditional employer-employee relationship. So the coverage question is a much more difficult question. But to solve either of these questions, you really, really need to follow what I will always consider to be the Tom Perez advice. Tom Perez being the second Secretary of Labor for whom I worked. And it was advice that he gave us at EBSA when he came, and when he came and we briefed him on the conflict of interest rule. It isn't, to me, new advice, but I think he said it most succinctly. And to solve any of these hard problems, you absolutely need to follow the Perez principles. Build a big table, invite all of the stakeholders, whether you like them or you don't like them, whether they're with you or against you. Invite all of the stakeholders to have a seat at the table. Listen, learn, be humble. Now, this humbleness thing, it took me a little bit to figure out what he was talking about, but it really is. These are all principles that I've operated under in my public career, my public sector career. And the last one, this humility, is really important. And it's important for people within the government to understand, and it's important for people in the private sector to understand. And it sort of goes like this. It's, whenever you're working on a difficult problem, it's really important to not be amorphous too long. You need to begin to put on the table potential solutions to the problem. And that's a hard thing. It's really hard to be the first one to put a proposal on a table because you're going to get killed from every side. But you need to do it because that's the way you get the process started. You put something on the table, and it's called a proposal because it's the first step to solving a problem. And some problems, it may take longer or they may never get solved, but you have to have a proposal. But once you put that proposal on the table, you have to I'm not sure how to say this in words that won't sound weaselly, but you have to be able to recognize and appreciate that there are lots of different ways to achieve a goal. There's never just one path to, it's like I'm going to go to the grocery store and I drive to the end of my street. This is actually true. I drive the 2 blocks to the end of my street and I see they're doing construction. Now, the easiest way for me to get to the grocery store is to go through that intersection, but I can't do that. So I have to think of alternatives to get to that grocery store because my goal is to get that milk so that tomorrow morning I can have cereal. And so when you're in the government or in the private sector for that matter, you start with a proposal on the table, and then you have to have enough humility to recognize that others may have different and better ways to achieve that goal than the proposal you put on the table. So you need flexibility. And that's, I'm sort of rambling here, but those Perez principles, I think, are the way we should attack all of the problems that we face. Because I think the framework for solving the problems is a good one. And it's certainly the thing that I'm the proudest of in terms of our dealing with a conflict of interest rule. Because no matter how much we were criticized, I know, and I'm really proud that my staff was able to do this. They gathered all the information from as many sources as we could. We said no to no one. Our door was open to everybody. And then we approached the task with humility. We weren't wedded to every single thing we had in our proposal. We were wedded to the goal of creating an accountable standard to minimize conflicts of interest, but we were willing to accept and to act on and to incorporate suggestions made by lots of people, including most of the suggestions that we adopted were things that the industry suggested to us. And so I think the 2 things that I wish I had had more time to work on were this creating a climate in which lifetime income streams are encouraged and adopted, and trying to figure out a way to get more employers and other structures in place to allow people to save through the workplace. Because the research, the data, that shows definitively that the most effective and efficient way to save is at the workplace. So those are the 2 things that I wish I had had more time to deal with. But on the coverage thing, I just want to make one other point. And that is an interesting point, and one that might seem counterintuitive. One of the problems I see in the coverage area is that if we're trying to encourage employers to become plan sponsors, they have too much choice. There are too many choices, and it's too complicated for them to navigate. I say this because one of the things that I learned when I came to the Department of Labor is the EBSA staff, the benefit advisors who are out in the different regions of the country, who are throughout the country, they do, roughly 200 retirement type programs in their local communities. They often do them they almost always do them with the IRS and Social Security. And they do consumer, programs, financial planning programs, retirement planning programs. But the 2 that I want to focus on for a second here are the ones that are targeted at employers, particularly small employers. They do one set of programs that are basically compliance assistance. They say to an employer, okay, now you've got your 401k plan or your 403b or your 457, because while they focus on 401k, they have people there who have other kinds of programs, and they try to help them answer the questions. And they go through the basic rules and say, this is the way you comply. They have another set of programs they do, and they do these often in conjunction with local chambers or other business groups, small business groups in the community. And this is for employers who don't have plans, but who we hope might be willing to try plans. And they talk about the variety of arrangements that an employer can sponsor, savings arrangements. Obviously, some that they contribute to, most that they contribute to, but some that they can just set up and use payroll deduction for. And at the end of each of these programs, regardless of whether they're for individuals or small employers, they have an evaluation form. And for anybody out in the audience here, the listeners, who has done some sort of a training program or a conference, it's really important to get the input of the people who were participants so that you can improve the program for the next time you do it. And what was eye-opening to me as I was briefed on the results of these evaluations, is in the sessions that were directed at employers that didn't have programs, the universal complaint was too many choices, too complicated. And so my goal, if I had had the time to do it, is not what the Hill is doing, which is trying to make 20 more million flowers bloom and creating new sorts of arrangements, which are only, honestly, designed to cannibalize the current 401k plan business or your competitor's 401k plan business. They really, even though they're marketed as, oh, this is going to improve coverage, I mean, even the GAO report on, for instance, these open MEPs says,
yeah, I was just going to say, is that what you're talking? You're talking about the open MEP?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, because we really didn't want to waste a whole lot of time on that, because it isn't really a vehicle, as much as the rhetoric says it improves coverage. There's really no evidence that it does. And if you look at the ones that are out there, while there may be some marginal gain of new employers, mostly it's just recycling the current employers that already are with the financial services company in their 401k plan, or with their competitors. So, but if you really want to focus on what will make people interested in sponsoring a plan, I think there's a lesson to be learned from those evaluations, where the employers who were at least interested enough to come to a program on it, their bottom line, after they sat through a couple of hours of discussion of this, was, this is way too complicated. I have way too many choices. All I need. And there are some simple ways to do it. You can offer a master and prototype plan. You can offer a simple IRA. I mean, there are some simple programs out there. But when you have too many choices, it encourages inaction.
Yeah.
So I think Congress is going in the wrong direction in terms of coverage. I think they shouldn't be trying to think of more vehicles. They should probably try to focus on, are there ways that we can consolidate the vehicles out here, particularly for the small side of the market? If you're AT&T, fine, you have plenty of choices. But if you're at the small side of the market, then I think trying to work with small employers, not their lobbyists, but the actual small employers, is probably what I would have devoted more time to had I had it.
One thing that you said that I think is kind of interesting is that I think when you talk to some people in the industry, or again, people I hear from, and why don't more employers offer retirement plans? It's cost. They don't want to be a fiduciary. That's what I've heard. And I think it's an interesting insight that those feedback forms bring, is that it's just, hey, it's choice overload. And, we talk about that with participants in retirement plans
Exactly.
having too many choices, and they just either put the pencil down or they stop enrolling or they make poor choices. But I think that's an interesting observation around employers and how that could be impacting coverage.
Well, and when you think about the way these survey forms are developed, employers are given choices. They always say too much regulation, fiduciary responsibility. I don't know that I've seen many that focus on choice overload as one of the choices. They may say other,
mm-hmm.
but it is, it is. I'm not suggesting that there aren't things that worry employers, but when you peel away the layers of the onion here, and you're trying, and I've looked at a fair amount of research on this coverage question, why employers do or do not offer retirement programs. And there are two things that usually get lost in this discussion besides this choice overload. The first is the uncertainty of the continuance of the business.
Yeah.
Because because a number of people in my family have been small business people, some successful, some not so. The idea of committing to a retirement program, which is a long-term commitment, even if you set up something that's just payroll deduction, there's still an expectation that your employees are going to have, that you'll continue that. When the business future of small business is so uncertain, the first few years, and as you go into the business at various other points based on, the economics of it, you're just fighting to keep your business alive. You can have all good intentions, and most of the small business people that I've talked to, in conjunction with the ACA, I did a lot of outreach to small businesses, and all over the country, and I met with small groups of small businesses, often with local chambers and other groups of minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses. And the number one thing they worry about is keeping their business going.
Yeah.
And not wanting to have to lose jobs, But once they make the commitment to offer a job, they want to be able to continue. And then, of course, the other fact is that if you are a small business and you manage to be successful, the first benefit you're going to offer is health insurance, not pension benefits of any kind. So you have to be a fairly stable business to be willing to offer a pension. And that's why it's so important for the product that you offer to be simple and understandable. Because it is daunting to say to somebody, oh, yeah, well, you have to hire an actuary, you have to hire an accountant, you have to hire this, you have to hire that. If there was some just simple, that's why master and prototype plans, I'm a big fan of master and prototype plans, because they're so simple to establish and to administer. Now, there are other things that the Department of Labor could do to simplify some of the reporting requirements on the 5,500 side, because I do understand that is a daunting and burdensome requirement for some people. And I think there are things that the Department of Labor could do in that area that would be helpful. But I think this coverage question, people have been looking at it for years, and everybody comes up with some, what they think is a great solution. But it always involves a new product,
right,
that provides lesser consumer protection. And that's just a recipe for disaster as far as I'm concerned. I mean, that's why I'm so concerned about these open MEPs. The idea of aggregating buying power and, administrative expenses and that sort of stuff, those are good things. But not at the price of reducing consumer protections. We've seen so many abuses. So, the easier it is for somebody to offer a product, the easier it is for a well-meaning employer who's trying to do the right thing to be taken for a ride and ultimately have losses to the participants. So I actually think it would be better if people tried to focus on, are there ways that we can consolidate and simplify, not add new products?
Well, and let me do two things here. So I think there's a couple forces in play right now that I just would love to get your input on. We have states that are creating their own retirement plans, and they are actively going or actively trying to put a solution out there that will help with the coverage problem. And, I think, we've got Oregon that's live. I think I saw, well, I think there was another one that went live. I know California, out in my world.
Well, Illinois was supposed to, too. Well, anybody who's followed my career from the beginning knows that I'm not a big fan of, in some areas, I think it's really important for the states to move forward and experiment. The pension area, I think we've been well served by having a single federal standard. Having said that, I met with and talked with and followed and watched and listened to many of the state folks who were incredibly frustrated, and understandably so, that nothing was happening. We've got nothing but gridlock on the federal level. And what they were seeing was their constituents being less and less likely to be able to save for their retirement. The retail IRAs are not a solution, I don't think, myself. I cited the research.
Meaning basically, what's the big issue here? We've got these retail IRAs that if somebody's really motivated to save, they can just go open one up.
The fact is that inertia is very, very powerful. And until and unless we get to a point where the IRA marketplace has consumer protections like the plan marketplace, hint, hint, back to our fiduciary rule, I am reluctant to say to people, oh, just find some broker and, set up an IRA. I think the plan sponsor as the intervening fiduciary is a terrific protection for consumers. I know it's a burden for plan sponsors as well, but so I understand the frustration of the states, and they actually see it in not just sort of public good terms, but fiscal terms, because they certainly understand that if their citizens wind up in retirement without adequate savings to supplement Social Security, and Social Security is as close to universal as we have in this country, but not completely universal, it's going to be a drain on their public programs. Mm-hmm. And as the federal government shifts more and more of those costs of the social safety net back to the states, there's a fiscal concern that they have as well. So I can't say I was I was not leading the parade in having the states do this. I think that's probably a fair characterization. But I did come to the point where I understood And I was willing to do whatever we could at the Department of Labor to, maybe encourage is too strong a word, to facilitate the ability of states that wanted to do this to do it in a responsible fashion, consistent with ERISA. And so there was a lot of interest on the part of Secretary Perez in trying to do something like this, help clarify the rules for them. There was a lot of interest on the part of the White House. And so we did our best to try to give the states clearer guidance on how, if they wanted to do this, they could do it. And I, of course, was disappointed that one of the first things out of the box the new administration did was to, encourage Congress to nullify them through the Congressional Review Act, the guidance we put out. Because I don't think that there would have been an overwhelming number of states that would have decided to move forward in this area. And really, if the arguments that the private sector does this best, the private sector has had 40 years to reach this audience. And if they can't and haven't, and believe me, despite the fact that they all cry crocodile tears about what happens to poor small savers,
right,
it's not like they run out and market their products to them. If you look at the research shows they're not servicing that market. And there are some people, even though some people are very anti-government, there are some people that would trust, and this is all a matter of trust, that would trust a government program more than they would a for-profit financial services private sector program to do the right thing by their investments. So, if you believe, as I do, in the employment-based system, I'm definitely a half full versus half empty person. And I think, while not perfect, the employment-based system has worked. And I commend the employers that are willing to sponsor these arrangements and stick with them despite, the difficulties they have with them. And I think their employees are better off for it. So anything that creates these group programs, I think, is a step. Well, I shouldn't say anything, because some of them, like some of the proposals on the Hill, where they're taking away all the fiduciary responsibility, even for prudently selecting and monitoring a service provider. That's a bit extreme. But so I have come around. I've had an epiphany on whether I think in this discrete instance the states should move forward. And I've come around to the fact that as long as the federal government is not going to do anything that will significantly improve coverage, if these states are willing to do it, then good for them.
Well, and when you say the federal government is not going to do anything, just to make sure I'm following you on that one, it's
Congress.
There's Congress. Yeah, I'm just saying there's a proposal for this open MEP thing, but in your opinion,
but
that's
it doesn't.
Not going to.
It isn't. It's not going to move the ball
right.
forward.
Yeah, that's not going to move the needle.
Right.
Just out of curiosity, during your tenure or just in any conversations you've had, is there this idea of, some type of federal program that would supplant the employer-sponsored plans that are out there today? Is that a possibility?
Yeah,
or is that dead on?
And by the way, on the open MEPS issue, we were working on proposals within the administration, within the Department of Labor, that would accommodate some greater flexibility to create these multiple employer plans, but not go as far as remove all the consumer protections like the Hill proposals, like the industry proposals that are being considered on the Hill. But yes, I myself, from the early 80s, when I was working on Capitol Hill, have been sort of working on a proposal, and we tried to move it forward a little bit at the Department of Labor, that would create big risk pools. The first course that I taught when I went to George Washington University was regulation of insurance, and Insurance 101 is get everybody into the pool. Now, it was on the health insurance side, but the same thing is true on the pension side. So my proposal that I was working on would have created, in fact, I would have created 10, one each for each of the Federal Reserve districts, 10 big regional pension programs. And the people who employers could sign up, particularly small employers, could sign up and offer their programs. There would be basically it could be I was more thinking of the old-time floor offset programs where you'd have a defined benefit component and then a savings component above it. And it would, employers could decide to offer their employees benefits through that. Individuals who worked for employers that didn't want to offer or didn't offer a pension plan could sign up as individuals. Self-employed people could sign up. And so in this program, you could have conceivably both employer and employee contributions, because I think one of the things that's inhibited coverage is Congress made very stark distinctions between DB plans and DC plans in ERISA. And they really didn't make, and in one case, the burden all falls on the risk all falls on the employer. In the other case, the risk all falls on the employee. I think it's time for Congress to consider some sort of a hybrid arrangement. I don't want to use that term because it connotes a type of plan that I'm not necessarily endorsing, but this was my proposal that I was working on was based sort of very loosely on the multi-employer structure, where a bunch of different but it expanded on it because it allowed individuals whose employers didn't have a plan to participate, to save for their retirement. And it would be each year the benefit would be calculated, and you would, based on your contribution. So it would be never really underfunded, and the benefits would be adjusted based on the investment return. It would be invested through private sector board, a board of investments, sort of like the way they have it in the UK or in Canada. And what you'd get at the end of the road, if you contributed for 18 years, you get 18 pieces of your benefit. And I would have allowed people to roll their money in there if they were changing jobs. So these would be basically big regional pools, and they'd be federal. There'd be federal rules, or they would be under ERISA, and there may be some other federal rules. And I started working on this proposal in the early 80s, I guess. And we talked about it when I worked on Capitol Hill, and we talked about including it in a piece of legislation. The late Senator Hines and my former boss, Congressman Bill Clay, were working on a series of pension legislation, and we talked about including it there. Honestly, I didn't get much traction for it. People were not all that interested in it, but I still retain my own interest in it. And when I got to the Labor Department, initially we tried to do it was the first time I actually had access to actuaries and economists who could try to do some modeling. And we did some work on it in the first couple of years of the Obama administration, and then just our workload got overshadowed by other things and we had to abandon it. Senator Harkin's proposal picked up some quite independently of, well, I guess maybe not completely independently, but Senator Harkin's proposal picked up a lot of the same concepts, and he put it in legislative framework. And again, it didn't get much traction. But I do think if we were looking for a way to deal with some of the important problems, why aren't small employers in particular willing to start plans? Because they want to have reduced responsibility. They don't want to abdicate responsibility, but they don't want to have to deal with filing all the forms and doing this and doing that. So this would have given them an option of just avoiding all these individualized plans and going into this plan. Employees who worked for employers who didn't want to sponsor a plan could participate. And while it's true that when I started working on this in the 80s, we didn't have the so-called gig economy issues that we have now, it also would deal with self-employed and people with non-traditional workplace attachments. And I do think that's the way to go myself.
And I think everywhere you look that, the gig economy, the non-traditional workforce, I think is going to be a bigger challenge going forward. So having some type of framework where people can get some support for retirement savings in those more non-traditional relationships, I guess, I think that's going to be an important thing down the road, whatever form something takes.
Yeah. And I don't want to suggest that this is some easy solution.
Oh, sure.
Because the actuarial issues, the funding issues, the investment issues, though the governance issues, those are all critically important. And I was only superficial when I began to work on this. And I haven't had the time to go back and really, nor the staff, I don't have of course, I only had one actuary at my disposal at EBSA, but I mean, but I think there's a germ of an idea there, which again, could we apply the Perez principles of moving from a problem to a solution? Maybe that's ripe for that sort of discussion.
Yeah, and I was and one thing just, as we maybe round out a little bit, that I wanted to get a couple just thoughts for you on is that, I know you've mentioned the Perez principles, but as people have ideas, whether they be private sector, industry, government, to improve the retirement system to, whether it's coverage or income in retirement, whatever it might be, is there any other advice that you would give them based on some of your experience, good, bad, or indifferent, that you're like, all right, if you have this idea, know going into it that these are some things you're going to want to be aware of, these are some things you're going to want to think about, and to kind of move that forward, here's my, here's the wisdom I would impart upon you?
Well, I think I learned a bunch of lessons from my experience, certainly at the Labor Department. And I guess probably because it took up the two things that took up the most time in my 8 years were implementation of the Affordable Care Act and the conflict of interest rule. And the Affordable Care Act, despite the fact that it involved 3 agencies and 6 sets of lawyers, if you include the White House counsel and the Justice Department people, which we always had to because we knew we were going to be sued a million ways till Sunday. That was a much easier process, although I wouldn't have thought that at the beginning because it involved so many different kinds of stakeholders. The conflict, the lessons that I learned from my experience, particularly with the conflict of interest rule, is that, what's that old cliche? There's no wrong time to do the right thing. But when you decide to tackle a problem as difficult as conflicts, you have to recognize going forward that it's going to be hard, that you have to be patient. It can't happen overnight. And you have to have a plan and a fallback plan and another and another and another. You have to have multiple plans. And you can't just embark on something without sort of thinking through the options. The other thing I learned is that the Perez principle that says build a big table and invite all the stakeholders really does mean invite all the stakeholders. Talking to yourself or talking to like-minded stakeholders and developing your proposal in that kind of a vacuum is not going to move the ball, because it's rare nowadays when sheer muscle can get anything accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
You really do need to be able to hear and get out on the table the varying concerns of all of the stakeholders, because it's only when you get everything, all the issues out on the table, that you can begin to sort through them and try to figure out how best. You're never going to satisfy everybody, but you won't satisfy anybody but your friends if you don't talk to people who might have differing points of view. And you know, honestly, that's one of the things that I've done over my whole career, is that I've tried to seek out people that I know disagree with me. And sometimes I become more convinced that I'm right, but oftentimes I become convinced that there are better ways to do things. And if you're really going to get things accomplished, you have to work with everybody. You can't just work within your vacuum. It's so much more comfortable and easy to work with people who agree with you, which is why I said it's a hard thing. These are hard issues. And if there was a simple solution, they would have been done a long time ago. You know, I'll sort of end my ramblings with this one little story. A few years ago, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the passage of ERISA in 2014. And I had been thinking about, I was excited that I was at the Department of Labor when the 40th anniversary came. And I had been thinking about what the best way to recognize the anniversary was and how to do it in a constructive way. And I had been distressed for a number of years at the partisanship and the, you know, lack of cooperation among the various factions within Congress, within the private sector, et cetera. And so what I decided to do is I decided that I would host a roundtable, and I would invite as many of the living, because inviting dead people doesn't usually work, but all the living assistant secretaries from the beginning of the agency, from 1974 forward. And some of them weren't assistant secretaries, some of them were just administrators. But I would invite all the people who were still alive who had held that job, the head of EBSA, or PWBA, which is what it was called before EBSA. And I was thrilled that I managed to get more than half of them. And just by happen chance, it was evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And what we did, I worked with my staff, and what we did was we came up with a series of questions. And my goal was really twofold. My goal was to show, A, the problems hadn't changed, and it was just as tough to deal with them as it was back in 1974. But B, that there was a bipartisan consensus as to what the problems were, and to some lesser extent, perhaps, what potential areas of solution were. But not complete consensus on the solutions, but there was consensus on the problems. And we did this roundtable, and I was thrilled because that's really what the bottom line was of this roundtable. And I don't know whether the people listening to this podcast can still find it, because we had it on our website during the Obama administration, and I understand new administrations take a lot of things off the website, so you might not be able to find it. But it was a fascinating experience. And after the whole thing was over, and one of the things that we did is we invited for the audience, broad set, anybody that we could think of that was involved either in the pre-ERISA days or the post-ERISA days. And I was very happy to see some of the people who were involved in the drafting of ERISA, the passage of ERISA, you know, the conceptualizing of ERISA, as well, some of the old-timers as well as the newer people. And one of the old-timers, who will remain anonymous, came up to me after the session, and I said to him, I thanked him so much for coming, and I said, I was really disappointed that you didn't, you know, a lot of people stood up at the end and made comments or asked questions, And he said, I said, I was looking out there in the audience and you were just sort of shaking your head. And he said, that's because there isn't anything that all of you had identified as an issue that members of Congress, when we worked on ERISA, didn't recognize as an issue. But they lacked the political will or the technical skills or both to deal with them. And he said he was chuckling to himself that even 40 years later, the problems were the same and the difficulties, both technical and political, still remained. So to me, that was the lesson that these are hard problems, but we can't give up. We have to keep thinking of ways to bring people in and maybe get new eyes, fresh eyes, sometimes have different ways of looking at things. But I have to say that I was criticized for saying this in connection with the conflict of interest rule, but I think it's probably true, and I'll say it again, which is many of the issues that I dealt with in my 8 years as assistant secretary, I felt like I was in the movie Groundhog Day, because they would come back and they never go away. They just keep coming back. And each time you think maybe we'll make a little progress, and sometimes you do, but oftentimes you don't. But that doesn't mean that you should give up. You need to keep talking to everybody and keep moving forward, because that's the only way we'll ultimately solve some of these problems.
I really appreciate you sharing that. And as you were kind of wrapping up your thoughts, one thing that came to mind is for people that want to get more involved and participate in solutions, do you have any suggestions for them on where do they go? Who do they talk to? How could
that's a wonderful question.
Yeah. How can they start participating in this conversation?
Well, that's an excellent question, because the problem is that nobody immediately comes to mind as a natural convener for these sorts of issues. I mean, you'd want to say, oh, go to this organization or that organization, but nobody immediately comes to mind. Now, were I still at EBSA, my staff would say, we should convene it. And maybe that's a good place to start. But you'd have to have somebody over there. I mean, I haven't discussed this with Preston Rutledge, but you'd have to have somebody over there who'd be interested in convening such a group.
Yeah.
And the turnover is so much greater on the Hill, so I would not necessarily think the Hill would be a productive space to.
Well, yeah, and I was just going to say, is this a call your congressman or senator, or is that not a fruitful path either?
Well, that creates kind of a disbursement of, most of these members of Congress don't really have a pathway to these sorts of issues. You'd have to have like a think tank or a not-for-profit organization.
Yeah, well, maybe that's the challenge or the gauntlet that we lay down for any of our listeners, is to the extent that they agree or want to take the bull by the horns.
Somebody needs to pull together a group.
There we go. Maybe it'll be one of our listeners, and this will be their call to action.
Maybe. That would be great.
Last question, maybe. I know acting in a fiduciary capacity holds a special place in your heart. And
right.
in having that fiduciary oversight of participants or investors' dollars is, something I know you spend a lot of time and energy on. Why is that? Like, what drives that belief and feeling inside you? And I know there's going to be some additional bites at the apple here going forward to rethink or redo some of the way that the industry or advisors, et cetera, can work or need to work with investors. what advice would you kind of give them, or what thoughts would you share with them as that process unfolds?
Well, to me, the linchpin of the whole process is a fiduciary standard. A fiduciary standard represents, to my mind, a legally enforceable way to hold people accountable. A fiduciary standard is not the same as acting in your client's best interest, although acting in your client's best interest is part of what it means to be a fiduciary. Acting in the client's best interest is a goal, very amorphous, hard to define, not legally enforceable. A fiduciary, you can go back 200 years and find definitions in the law of trusts, in all the legal codes of Western civilized countries as to what it means to be a fiduciary. So it's a legally enforceable standard. And if you just say to people, you have to act in your client's best interest, that's an amorphous goal that can easily be avoided. It can lull people into thinking that they're getting something from their advisor that they may or may not be getting. But once you say, if you go back and look at the literature, the reason people don't seek financial advice is because they don't know who to trust. So it's a question of trust. And it isn't enough to say to people who want to be advisors, you have to act in your client's best interest, because that doesn't help. It's a marketing slogan. It doesn't have legal import. And you can try to define it, but it isn't, absent a statutory definition, it's not legally enforceable. And that's why we thought it was so very important that if you want to hold yourself out, and this is business model neutral in the sense that, I don't care if you're a registered investment advisor or a broker, dealer. So that's what I mean by business model neutral. Sure. If your business model is built on conflicts of interest, then obviously it's not a business model neutral rule. But that, to me, that's the heart of the matter. Can you trust me? Because if I violate my fiduciary duty, you have a legally enforceable right to hold me accountable. So to me, that's the difference between the two of them, and why I feel so strongly that the way to deal with conflicts of interest, because you're never going to get rid of conflicts of interest. Sure. It's ridiculous. We spent a lot of time talking to my staff primarily, although I was involved in some of them, and actually Secretary Perez made a couple of trips when he was abroad and talked with the regulators in the UK. They took a different approach. They banned commissions because they concluded that there was no way to mitigate conflicts. You just had to say you couldn't have a commission. Well, there are lots of different ways that you could have conflicts of interest beyond just commissions. And we decided that that was too radical and we weren't going to do that. But the issue really, the next step after creating the best way to create this climate of trust and thus increase the likelihood that people are willing to get investment advice, because God knows we all need it, is to make sure that people who purport to be the experts and want to give advice are all held to the same legal standard. And as long as you have different legal standards, investors are always going to be confused. They're not always going to be willing to trust everybody. And the system will continue to limp along the way it is. Because the people who are the most vulnerable in the current system are people who are trying to do the right thing. The individuals who are most vulnerable are the individuals who have saved the most, because they're the ripest targets for unscrupulous advisors or conflicted advisors. And it's not a matter of bad people. I'm not talking about bad people. I'm talking about a system in which the financial incentives are aligned in such a way that they do not encourage people to act in their client's best interest or adopt a fiduciary standard. They encourage certain people to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And, sales are sales. Sometimes they're good for you. Sometimes the products are not. So having a level playing field, I think, is really critically important. A level playing field of a fiduciary standard to which people can be held legally, enforceably. And enforceable, let's see, what did the Perez principles called it? A legally enforceable fiduciary standard. And that's the important thing to me. That's why I feel so strongly about it, because I do think people need financial advice. And if you start with the data as to why people aren't willing to get it when they need it, it's because they don't have trust that the people are going to give them good advice.
I appreciate that insight there. So, Phyllis, really appreciate everything you shared today. I mean, thank you again for being gracious with your time and gracious with your insights. And certainly, I know there's a lot more that I'd love to ask you, and I'm sure there's more that over the years that you can share. So we'd love to, sometime down the road, have an opportunity to have you back.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, Rick, and thanks to all the people who are listening to the podcast.
All right, there you have it. The Honorable Phyllis Borzi, former Assistant Secretary of Labor and head of the Employee Benefits Security Administration under President Obama. I got to be honest, I just try to ask a couple good questions and stay out of the way and let her share as much information as she was willing to share. One of my favorites was when she shared the story about celebrating the 40th anniversary of ERISA and how so many people there were just saying, wow, I can't believe we're still talking about the same stuff we were talking about 40 years ago. I know this was a 90-minute episode, but I really feel like I could have kept going for a lot longer if she didn't have a dinner engagement to get to. I still have about 4 or 5 questions on my list that I wanted to ask her, so hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have her back. With that in mind, if you have questions I should ask Phyllis on a future episode, send them to me at feedback@401kfridays.com. Love to hear them, and hopefully we can pull them together and get her back for round 2. Also, if you're new to the podcast and not subscribed yet, just go to 401kfridays.com or search 401k Fridays on your favorite podcast app. To make it easy, we also have our top 10 episodes listed on the website homepage, and those are usually a good place to start if you're looking for some of our quote-unquote best hits. In the coming weeks, we're going to share some thoughts on how to reposition HSA plans with your employees, a few low-cost and high-value financial wellness strategies that might not apply to everyone, but will mean the world to those it does apply to, and what the heck is ESG investing and does it belong in 401k plans? That's it for today. Until next time, I hope you make your Friday a 401k Friday. And now for some disclosures. The content in this podcast is provided for educational and discussion purposes only. Investing involves risk, including a potential loss of investment. Lockton does not and cannot guarantee the future performance or specific level of performance, the success of any investment, or success of any strategy. Nothing contained herein may be construed as investment or legal advice.